Welcome to Scoop, where you get the scoop on this week's news. My name is Jenna, and this is Smarter News. I want to do something a little bit unusual as we start off Scoop today, and that is to just say thank you. Thank you for your support of independent journalism. Thank you for your support of Smarter News in this massive breaking news period that we've been in really over the last several weeks and arguably in the last several years. You have been the force behind making sure that Smarter News continues. And without you, we would lack the purpose and the inspiration that we need on a regular basis to continue to deliver quick, concise, nonpartisan news. The events that have transpired over the last several days are a reminder about why the press is important and why quick, concise, nonpartisan news is important. And although there's a rush into reports, and I feel that in my heart, just like any journalist who wants to provide answers to questions that sometimes we don't have, it's a reminder about why discipline matters. And that's why Smarter News is here, because I want to provide an alternative, but it would not exist without you. So I wanted to start with a thank you. I also wanted to start with a recognition that the witnessing of an attempted assassination of anyone, let alone a political candidate for office, let alone a former president of the United States of America, is not only historic, it's not only notable, it's also traumatic. It also is something that's difficult and emotional to watch. And the reaction after is also difficult and emotional. And I really wanted to check in with you today. I know we're not doing that on a regular broadcast on the news. This is important what we're witnessing. We're in an important period in American history. It is also emotional. And I think we can approach it with compassion and curiosity, which are the trademarks here on Smarter News and are the trademarks that you have also inspired. So, how are you? How are you feeling about all of this? There's a lot of questions that are lingering today. And I wish today I had more answers. We are not yet 48 hours after this event that happened on Saturday night. And I'm hopeful this week that we get more answers. But there have been some unusual or extraordinary circumstances around the way this story has been reported. We're going to talk about that. Our conversation today is really going to be divided into three parts. We have breaking news on a case facing former President Trump. We're going to talk about that briefly. We're going to talk about the attempted assassination that took place in Pennsylvania. I was just able to speak to an eyewitness who was at his very first Trump rally ever. And you're going to get a little bit of our interview and some of the important parts of it. And then we're going to turn, because this week is going to be a breaking news week. So buckle up. It's really true. It's not going to end here. We're going to get breaking news likely on this investigation that's going to continue. But now we're turning to the Republican National Convention. And we're going to learn who is the vice presidential nominee for President Trump. We're going to learn things. We're going to watch for tone. We're going to watch for cadence. We're going to watch to see how does the Republican Party adjust or change or reflect in the aftermath of this historic event. And we have a special guest joining us today. Edward Acorn is the author of The Lincoln Miracle. Did you know Abraham Lincoln received the presidential nomination because of a brokered convention? You know, we have such a different view of him because of history, but politically there was turmoil within the Republican Party. And because we've talked about the possibility that both main party candidates in this election cycle may or may not be the candidate that's on the ticket. And we've discussed that for different reasons, whether it's legal challenges, whether it's health reasons. There's been all sorts of discussion about that. I thought this would be really an interesting conversation. So Ed's waiting for us in the wings, and he's going to take your questions as well. So this is going to be a packed show, and I'm really excited about it. Let's start first with the breaking news this morning. We got news that the judge in Florida has dismissed the federal case against former President Trump over his handling of classified information. The reason why she did this is notable. Let me just kind of back up in order to understand what took place here. There's been all sorts of challenges from President Trump's team, as would be the case for anyone's team that's facing some pretty serious charges. There's going to, in the lead up to a trial, you're going to have both teams jostling for clarification or for position, requesting dismissal, requesting, questions about evidence, all sorts of things is going to take place. And one of the questions that came up from President Trump's team was about the validity of the special prosecutor in this case. Remember, the federal government, the Justice Department, appointed a special prosecutor to litigate these two cases that President Trump faces on a federal level. There's the case of classified information, classified documents, and the handling of that. There's also the case of election interference and obstruction, fraud that's sitting in the Washington, D.C. court. That DC court case is what made it to the Supreme Court with a question of, does the president have immunity against criminal charges? And as we know, the Supreme Court said, no, the president doesn't have complete immunity against charges, but he has some immunity. And that's how they kind of worked this out. Okay, that's a very brief explanation to what could be very complicated legally in the next several weeks, months, and years to come. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote in a concurring opinion, so he's supporting the opinion of the court, the majority of the court, that he had a question about the special prosecutor and whether or not the special prosecutor had the validity to litigate these cases, because the question was, does the special prosecutor have too much power without the approval of the people, of Congress? Now, a special prosecutor has been designated by the Justice Department in a wide variety of cases for decades. It's a way for the Justice Department to say, okay, this could be a politically loaded case, so we're going to put a special prosecutor there in order to kind of create a little bit of a barrier. They're going to operate independently, but still tethered to the Justice Department. And a question came up earlier this year, even before Clarence Thomas wrote about it, by the lawyers for Trump, whether or not this special prosecutor had too much power. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of all of that, that's basically what the judge said in Florida. I'm dismissing this case on the grounds that there's this about the appointment of the special prosecutor. This will likely be challenged. It's not the end of the story, but expect that challenge also to come in the Washington, D.C. case. And for now, the case that President Trump faces in Florida is dismissed. That's a huge development. So you have the New York, quote unquote, hush money case that the Supreme Court ruling on immunity has now pushed off the sentencing to potentially September, although there's a question about whether or not that whole case could have to be retried, that there could be a mistrial. Then you have another case in Georgia having to do with the election. And then you had these two federal cases. This is very big news. It's very big news, and it's a change. So for now, those charges that former President Trump was facing he's no longer facing them in court. And so we'll see what happens next. That's big news also coming after this weekend, where we've had a lot of focus on former President Trump for obvious reasons. We had an attempted assassination of him at a rally in Pennsylvania. And I know many of you have many questions about this continuing developing story. And I think if there's one thing that I can share with you today, just from a reporter or journalism background, it's to remind ourselves on a regular basis, this is a developing story. It is a developing story at its core, and we still don't have a lot of answers. What I'd like to do right now is just work through the who, what, where, when, how, and why. Those are the basics. We learn that in elementary school. When you learn about journalism, don't you learn that? Listen, I sometimes in breaking news environments, I still write that on my paper because it makes me stay disciplined to what is the information we really need to know. Of those different facets, we have some answers and we don't have others. So what I'd like to draw out for you, though, are some of the important parts in this. So the timing, the when of this event is really critical. This event was happening in Pennsylvania. The where is also important. So let's bring these two things together. The timing of this event took place just before the Republican National Convention. So we know it's a big week for the Republicans. President Trump has been sort of low profile because there's been all this focus on President Biden. But now he's ready to step back into the spotlight. He's going to do so partly at this rally in Pennsylvania, an important swing state. We know the election in the previous years for president has been so close. It's really come down to these key swing states. So Pennsylvania is a strategic location. and he's going to be speaking at this rally. He's setting the tone for the events and the weeks to come next. The how and why this the shooting took place is still a big question. And in fact, what I'd like to do is play a little bit from the president. This is from the president's Oval Office address last night. In case you missed it, this is the first minute.
I want to speak to you tonight about the need for us to lower the temperature in our politics. And to remember, while we may disagree, we are not enemies. We're neighbors, we're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're fellow Americans. We must stand together. Yesterday's shooting at Donald Trump's rally in Pennsylvania calls on all of us to take a step back, take stock of where we are, how we go forward from here. Thankfully, former Trump is not seriously injured. I spoke with him last night. I'm grateful. He's doing well, and Jill and I keep him and his family in our prayers. We also extend our deepest condolences to the family of the victims who was killed. Corey was a husband, a father, a volunteer firefighter, a hero, sheltering his family from those bullets. We should all hold his family and all those injured in our prayers. Earlier today, I spoke about an ongoing investigation. We do not know the motive of the shooter yet. We don't know his opinions or affiliations. We don't know whether he had help or support, or if he communicated with anyone else. Law enforcement professionals, as I speak, are investigating those questions.
That was a really important comment at the end there, because it was an omission that we don't have that information. I thought that was extraordinary, watching the Oval Office event as a journalist and getting that information from the president. You never know what you're going to get from an Oval Office address. This can be an announcement at time of a declaration of war. I mean, this is what the Oval Office is used for big announcements. And every president has used this slightly differently, so it's not a judgment call. But the omission there, that we still have a lack of information, that the United States government, the most powerful government arguably in the world with some of the best resources, still doesn't have information about this shooter, was an extraordinary omission. I also thought, and part of the reason I wanted to play the sound from the president, and I don't want to waste another moment without mentioning this, there's obviously a lot of focus that President Trump was not killed. And we know how close it came to that it was just a few millimeters difference. It could be a completely different story, but someone was killed, and it was an innocent bystander, and it was a father. And so this was a deadly event. And we do know that there's 2 others critically injured. We also know that the suspected gunman, and I use that term because the FBI has used interesting language describing the person in question, the 20-year-old in question here, as a person suspected of involvement in an attempted assassination. Now, in the hours that come, or even in the hours that I've been focused on preparing for this broadcast, perhaps the language has become more specific. But there's been a real cautious nature in describing what actually happened here and what is going on with the investigation. It is extraordinary, speaking from experience of 20 years of covering a lot of different breaking news events, and certainly, unfortunately, far too many shootings than I would have ever liked to cover. Important news events, I want to be there for you during these times, but very difficult. And we would prefer that we cover no war and no crime and no shootings. That's what we would always love for peace. But it is extraordinary in this situation that we don't have more information. It is not typical. I'm not suggesting any reason why that is. I don't know why that is. But so from my background, that's extraordinary. And I'm anxious to get some more information. Many of you have had questions about, well, how did this person get so close? And what about all the warning signs? And what about what looked like a very obvious shot that could be taken by the Secret Service that is there for the president? And of course, we're looking at this through videos that are 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes on social media. It's very difficult to analyze. And I'm personally not an expert on some of these things, but it is difficult, and it certainly raises questions. It raises questions as well for the people that are in attendance. And Gary Tate was my guest just over the last hour. He was an eyewitness who attended the rally, and he was 5 rows away from former President Trump when this shot happened and when the shots were fired. And I wanted to share a little bit of our interview, it'll be up in full for you. But I wanted to, in this short period of time, just make sure to share a little bit of this interview with you because I thought you would find his perspective really interesting. Let's start here. Describe the security as you were in line and going through metal detectors to get in. What did you notice about the number of security, medical personnel, just the overall organization of the event?
I tell you that things were running very smoothly. That being said, though, I didn't see any security. Maybe at the beginning of the line where the water was being held out, there was a little bit of security. I think it was more so just to make sure that people weren't going through the VP line versus they had two separate lines. One line got you straight in, and I assume it took you straight up to the security, which didn't appear to be any line at all. So there probably wasn't many people that had that the wristband needed to get through there. But I really didn't see any security at all, in the line. And as far as medical personnel, there was a woman that had fainted, I assume due to the heat. And, people were just yelling, medic, medic, and kind of passing it down the line. And, several people, exited the line and came up to assist. But I don't know, I'm going to estimate that it took about 10 minutes before medical personnel arrived to give her the help that she needed. So there wasn't, from what I could see, there wasn't much medical personnel there, at least not in the proximity of where we were at.
I thought that was really an interesting observation from Gary. Again, he's never been to an event for President Trump. This was his very first time. He's going with his fiance and his fiance's 7-year-old mother, and they're going in. They're excited about this. But as we were speaking this morning, he said, it's just sort of interesting. I obviously didn't know what was going to happen, but as I'm in line and I'm going through the security, I'm sort of wondering where everybody is. When they get into the actual field where everyone was gathering, he also noted there was just kind of a lack of organization. Where you could sit was sort of wherever you could find. The crowds were very, very packed tightly together. You had to kind of step through people to try to get to a seat. They were really excited that they get this seat sort of in front, but it took them an hour to go back and get the mother that was sitting under a tent waiting in the shade because it was really hot. So this picture of just not a lot of personnel, not a lot of direction for an event for a presidential candidate was painted by Gary. And again, he even notes, and you'll hear, I believe, in one of his sound bites, he's like, this is my perspective. You're like, everyone else had different perspectives, but this was my perspective going in. So then I asked him, and you'll hear here, we kind of fast forward. President Trump was a little bit late coming to the stage. We know something about that because we watch live events together, don't we? This is true of a lot of different politicians. The timing can be a little bit behind. But now the crowd has been waiting for a few hours. And I asked him about the moment that we all witnessed. What happens? What do you hear that now we understood was a bullet? What was that moment like for you?
At the time, we didn't know what the noise was. We didn't know if it was someone, goofing off that had fireworks, firecrackers. He was just in the process of welcoming Dave McCormick to the stage, and right in that moment is when you heard everything go off. And it sounded to me, from my recollection, 5 or 6 shots. But again, we didn't know what that was, and it's a bit of a blur. But when things registered, everybody hit the ground. I grabbed my fiance and her mother, and we all got down on the ground and we covered our heads. Stayed down for, a few minutes, and people started to stand back up. So I got, I didn't get all the way up, but I got up onto my knees and looked around, and you could see a little bit of chaos going on to our right in the bleachers, towards the top of the bleachers. And again, we didn't know what had happened. So we didn't know if it was somebody that was involved with the shooting or firecrackers, whatever it was. I looked to my left and I saw the Secret Service personnel taking President Trump off of the stage. And Yeah, it was a frightening, very frightening moment. Um, you know, it's I had never been to an event like this before, and it just seemed surreal. There were people crying, not knowing what was going on. There were people very concerned about the safety of President Trump. Is he okay? We all went there for a reason, and it's because we love the man, and we feel like he gives us hope. And to think that that could have been taken away so quickly, it was just surreal. I don't know how else to say it. I can't. It was almost like a dream. I think there's moments that I lost. That I can't even tell you exactly the time frame, but it all happened within minutes. And it wasn't until we were all walking out. Everyone had different recollections of what happened. There were people that said they saw this, and it wasn't until I got home that I really knew that he was okay.
I wanted you to hear the tone of Gary's voice here and the pauses, because you can see that it's still a lot to process, and it was a lot to witness and to try to understand. Teresa, you had a great question. Have journalists been able to verify whether videos of people telling officers they saw the shooter climbing up ahead of time? Have you been able to, where do you get verification of those videos? That's a great question. And in this day and age, we have to be super careful about any videos that we're seeing, because the reality is that we know they can be altered, edited, audio can be brought in, all sorts of things can happen. So I think it's really important to proceed with caution of anything that you're seeing. However, the amount of video that has been kind of floating around the internet, and the fact that you have large media organizations, for example, the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal used video from someone that was apparently videotaping what is believed to be the shooter on the top of this building and the yelling for cops. I look at someone like the Wall Street Journal, or an organization like the Wall Street Journal or the Associated Press, for some of their, not just their editorial choices, but their legal choices. If they're going to be sharing video like that, there has to be some sort of verification process. Larger corporate media organizations typically are not going to just grab video. I can't say that they're never going to do that, but typically, because they're large organizations and they're worried about the legality of it. And so when I saw the Wall Street Journal grab that and put it up as part of their own video, I thought to myself, there's going to be obviously more to this than just these random videos floating around everywhere. There is some new reporting, by the way, about the alleged shooter. I'm still using that term, not because I don't think this person was the shooter, but because we're still getting information as to what transpired. I want to be the most responsible we can be as far as reporting this out. You've likely heard reporting that there was questions by people in the crowd looking up and seeing someone on a rooftop. I did ask Gary. I said, "Did you notice those buildings behind you?" And he said, "No, I didn't really notice." He's like, "There was a lot of people in the crowd, and I didn't really notice that." And the way that the angle would be, I don't know if I would notice it. But obviously, people that were in the way back or outside the perimeter obviously saw it. So here's the new reporting I saw from the Associated Press this morning, that instead of people just noticing someone was on the roof, that apparently some people had flagged this individual on the ground that as a suspicious person. Now, that has to also play out. We're getting a lot of law enforcement officials say, and we need to know what's actually confirmed. I mean, I'm still wondering where are the forensics for the bullets that were fired. Do we even have those collected? A very interesting insight from Gary was, I asked, did anyone talk to you afterwards? Were you just allowed to leave? Did all these people that witnessed this just allowed to leave? Did anyone get questioned about involvement? I mean, you never know. And he said, it's so interesting. No, we just walked out of there. No one took our name and number. We just left. Just left and tried to make our way kind of through this traffic and get ourselves home. I want to play this one last soundbite, and then we're going to move on as we're waiting for more information. One of the things I saw in the news was so much conjecture. I mean, there's so much conjecture. And this is an important topic I think we should talk about. And however you would like to look at this next, I'd love to, we could do it with a security expert. We could take this from a couple different angles, but I'm not going to fill your time with just a bunch of nonsense. Okay. We're not going to do that. We have the basics, the skeleton of what took place. We still don't know how and why this happened. We still don't have the key motive of this individual. And everybody's talking about political rhetoric. Words matter to me. We just talked about that. It's important that we choose very responsible language. But we actually don't know if political rhetoric is part of the motivation of this person. We actually have no idea. And let's play out a totally crazy scenario. Let's say the Russian bots got to this guy, or who knows? How much would that change the story? We're already far down the path that it's political rhetoric that did this. Now, I talked a little bit about this with Gary. You can tell he's a supporter of President Trump. But for balance, I also wanted to know what he thought moving forward about just what we've heard and how much this has potentially changed the tone and tenor of the presidential race. And I thought his reflection was one that you'd likely enjoy. So let me go ahead and play that. To political analyst, but I am curious about how you feel about this. There's been talk in the hours after this has happened about political rhetoric and that it's been too heated on both sides. And in this conversation that you can watch on the news, and certainly I'm a big consumer of news for what I do, there's been kind of this pushback on President Trump of, well, his tone is just as bad as everybody else's and everybody needs to elevate at this time. Now, we don't know if political rhetoric is what actually inspired this person. We actually have no idea what his motive is. But would you like to see a change even from President Trump and the Republicans after this in any measurable way? A tone change, a shift? Yes. Talk to us about that, because is this a time for self-reflection?
I think that is very important, that things change. I don't care for all of the rhetoric that goes back and forth between candidates. I mean, you did this, just the blaming back and forth. I'd be more concerned with what you're going to do. I'd like to hear what your plan is to fix things. And I think we've all seen that President Trump is a fighter. But would I like to see him change his tone? Both sides, because, as much as I hear about, in a situation like this, I'm hearing a lot about, this is a time for us to all come together. Every day should be that way. I'd love to see the conflict between parties, and, I'd love to see, there's so many families out there that have been destroyed over politics, and I just, I wish that we could all have civil conversations about it without letting it end relationships. I've lost friends over it, that we have different opinions. That's the great thing about America. We're allowed to have these different opinions, and we're allowed to talk about them. But I think it's very unfortunate that that we have the leaders of our country at times acting like children. Really, I mean, it would be nice if they could just talk civilly and work through things together, both sides, and I don't see any of that going on.
Will this be a change? It was interesting talking to Gary, and you'll hear about this in his interview. He says he has friends that are drastically different politically than him, and they go back years and years and they have debates. And he said what was really different about this time is that his friends called him to find out how he was. And when he expressed some thoughts, he just has a lot of thoughts about what took place. There wasn't any back and forth. There was also a desire to get some answers. And it was a moment for these relationships. And so is there a moment here where there is change? It's tough to know. We're going to be barreling right into the Republican National Convention. We're going to be hearing a lot about the Republican platform. We will do the same in August with the Democrats. but now it's going to be really focused on the Republican Party. So let's talk a little bit about that. The Republican National Convention is even more important this year in that sometimes you have it very telegraphed that you'll know who the vice presidential nominee is. In this case, we have no idea. And whoever vice president is taking on a more prominent role, because the reality of the danger that a president or a former president face has been lit up in Technicolor for us, that the person that is next in line is important. And so that's what we expect. That's some of the breaking news we expect from the Republican National Convention this week. Do we expect any other surprises? Who knows? We don't know. President Trump apparently in one interview said that he is rewriting his entire speech because it's going to be a completely different speech because of what transpired this weekend. So there's plenty of reasons to watch. We'll watch along with you. So let's take a moment just to talk a little bit about history. History matters here, and historical context perhaps can ground us in a time when it's easy to feel like we're kind of floating off the ground, right? That we don't have our feet planted. Let's talk a little bit about historical context, because there's been all these questions about what would happen. What would happen if President Trump, let's say in September, goes to jail because of the New York case, and then can he serve as president? And what would happen if his party decides that he's not the nominee because of these legal cases? What about President Biden? What about what happens with him? What if there's a health issue? What if his party doesn't like? I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of questions. And so just recently, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about a broker convention that happened in the 1860s. And it led to one of the most prominent presidencies of really American history. And the person that wrote that article and wrote the book about this is Edward Acorn. He wrote the book, The Lincoln Miracle, and he is our guest today. And thanks for your patience, Ed. We had a lot of news to get to, and I appreciate you hanging with us as we're doing this.
You said some very important things there.
Well, I appreciate that. We're trying our best to do something a little bit different in this time and really bring the press back to serve the people, And I know you have a background in journalism, and you have now this focus. You've done some incredible research, not only in this book, but another book about President Lincoln. And why don't we just start there? Why? I mean, I didn't know anything about this convention that led to his nomination. But before that, how did you get so fascinated with President Lincoln? Because to write a book like this, Ed, in the way that you do, by the way, it's beautifully written. It takes a certain passion. So talk to me about that. How did you get interested in President Lincoln?
Well, my dad, when I was a kid, gave me some books about the Civil War, and I started reading about Lincoln, and he's such an extraordinary figure. He's so intelligent. He came from nothing. He just grew by the force of his strength of character. He taught himself everything. He suffered repeated failures. That's part of the theme of this book, that this guy was out of office for more than a decade. He had lost 2 heartbreaking runs for the US Senate. And people did not take him seriously. He was, his executive experience was pretty much limited to running a 2-man law office. And then he's aspiring for the presidency. And it's really was a miracle that he was nominated at that convention, and a lot of horse trading went into it that people forget about. People think it's inevitable, Lincoln would rise, but it wasn't at all. It was almost an act of God. If you look at how many strange things fell into place to advance him.
Well, give us a few examples of that. I didn't realize that presidential candidates at the time, or hopefuls, weren't supposed to be there at the convention. So talk to us a little bit about how was the convention at that time set up, and what were some of the miraculous things that had to happen for Abraham Lincoln to suddenly become the nominee of the Republican Party?
Well, as you say, the candidates didn't go to the convention, and Lincoln was such a long shot, he contemplated going. It was right in Chicago, which was down the road from Springfield, where he lived. They actually chose Chicago as the site of the convention because they thought no serious candidate came from Illinois, so this would be a level playing field. And it turned out the guy from Illinois won it all. And he was he was a really long shot. William Seward, who was a senator from New York and had been the former governor of New York, had tons of money. He had tons of political support. He had probably the smartest political advisor in the country advising him, a guy named Thurlow Weed. And he was the most popular candidate with the delegates. So this was the setting for Lincoln's people moving into that convention. And I explained why Seward had people were afraid of nominating Seward. The thing that struck me working on this book is that the delegates of that convention were not choosing a president on the basis of who would be the best leader in a crisis, which would seem to be forming. They chose a president on the basis of who would get them the most votes, which meant jobs, patronage, all that stuff. And they figured Lincoln was less threatening than Seward, while appealing to the party's base. So all these strange strands came together, and Lincoln's men had to make deals to get him the nomination. Lincoln wrote a famous note to them saying, "Make no deals in my name. Don't commit me to anything." And Lincoln's manager, who was a very astute judge named David Davis, took a look at the note and said, "Lincoln ain't here." And Davis just went ahead and he offered cabinet positions in return for support at the convention, including to some pretty shady characters. So, and he even offered the same jobs to multiple delegations. So there's a lot of funny stuff going on in the background of these stories.
And the way that you see it now, with obviously Lincoln becoming a historic president, historic figure for many reasons, did the ends justify the means? How would you see it?
I would suppose so. Lincoln was kind of upset with some of the deals they made, but he put together a cabinet of very powerful, strong people who were strong contenders at that convention, actually. And I think if anybody else had been nominated at that convention, our country wouldn't exist today. I think it was that important. And the delegates didn't know this. They didn't know Lincoln's strengths, really. They didn't know his incredible political savvy and his way with words and his resilience and all that. They were choosing somebody they thought would get them the most votes, especially with swing voters. And boy, you look at it and you think, wow. And it culminated, Seward came very close to winning the nomination the second night of the convention. And the delegates decided to go take a break and eat and come back the next morning. And that's when things really happened for Lincoln overnight. So it was a very near thing that Lincoln was not nominated. And I just think that's such a striking story.
Well, and I too, which is why I wanted to talk. And I had these visions, I was telling Ed earlier, of like sitting down and relaxing this weekend after a tough couple weeks of news, just so I could really dig into the book. And of course we had breaking news. So I didn't get as far as I wanted in the book, but the way that you write it is extraordinary. And I really encourage anyone who's interested in this topic. It's beautiful. The descriptions that you have of just what Chicago looked like. There's a moment that you mentioned too, and I hope I get this right, Ed, you can correct me, where Lincoln is feeling dejected, and I forget the reason why, and he's like, my political career is over. And then he has this situation in the mud where he's like, I slipped, but I didn't fall. So like, it kind of was a metaphor of like, I slipped, but like, I didn't go down all the way. So maybe I'm still in there. I just didn't realize how the fortitude that Abraham Lincoln had to have to keep going in a time period where he didn't, like, a lot of things didn't break his way.
No, you're right. That happened after his famous campaign against Stephen Douglas. You remember the Lincoln-Douglas debates and all that. And he actually got more votes. Well, the Republicans got more votes than the Democrats. And if it was a popular election, he would have won. But the Democrats won more districts in the state legislature, and they chose the senators at that time. So he came very close there, and he thought his career was over at that point. And as you say, he was walking home after heavy rains, and he slid in the mud. And then he said, "That's a slip and not a fall." And that's so Lincolnian. He kept going against all sorts of difficulties, especially during that war where you look at the pictures, he just aged 20 years or something during that 4-year war.
Well, I'm curious for your perspective, because you've obviously heard a lot of conversation about contested or brokered conventions, uh, but you've actually looked into one where the results of it led America on a completely, arguably different course than it would ever be. As you mentioned, you don't know if a different individual was elected, if we'd have the same outcome. What do you think's missing from that conversation, or what do you think from history that we should keep in mind as we're watching a time in America that feels like a lot of turmoil, that feels like a lot of
Yeah.
chaos. And at the same time, we're reminded that we've been through periods in America where there's been a lot of turmoil and chaos.
Yeah. Well, when people say, "Oh my gosh, we're heading to another civil war," or "This is the worst it's ever been between people," no, I mean, look at the Civil War period. The terrible things happening then, the violence, the hatreds. And thank God we don't have something like slavery dividing this country anymore. So I don't think we're going down the path of the Civil War. I certainly hope not. And then you look at the Revolutionary period, same thing. It was bloody. It was terrible. It was horrific. We tend to think everything just worked its way out, and it didn't. We had to have very strong leaders, Washington and Lincoln, to get us where we are today. And maybe we still need strong leaders.
Mm-hmm. What did you think about this weekend? Here you've dug deep into a Republican presidency of importance that can almost not be articulated. And this Republican president was assassinated. And then we're witnessing the lead up to another election, an attempted assassination of a Republican candidate. I'm just curious what you felt like. What did you think through this weekend?
Well, you said that this weekend was difficult and emotional for people, and it was for me as well. It's just terrible. I mean, I've spent my life as a journalist and a historian, I hope, defending what this country is, which is the people are sovereign here. We resolve our differences through the political system peacefully. And I think a lot of stuff in the last few years have been attacking that idea. And we really have to get back on the path of the people get to decide who their president is. I mean, I've hated all this stuff, this lawfare aimed at Trump. Whatever you think of him, I don't think he should be stricken from the ballot. And I don't think these sort of farcical cases should be brought against a presidential candidate. Leave it to the people to decide who they want as president. If you can make a case that he shouldn't be president, of course, make that case and the people will decide. And that's the system we have to have. It just strikes me straight in the heart when something like this happens, when violence is used to try to silence the people and prevent them from doing what they have to do as the real leaders of this country. So it's just a terrible weekend for me.
I love what you just said there. The people are the real leaders of this country. And we also, part of the reason why the media is so important, why the journalism is important, while your storytelling is important, is that the stories that we tell each other become our reality. If we're not responsible with them, then we're giving ourselves a different impression. And what if we walked around thinking to ourselves, we're actually the leaders? And one of the things we try to remind people at Smart News is like, all these people actually work for you. You actually pay all their bills. You actually get to choose them. This is actually this is your country. And I loved how you phrased that. Just real quick before I let you go, Ed, because there are some questions about like unknowns and how political parties would figure it out. I'm just wondering practically, is there any lessons from what you learned in the Lincoln Convention that you think could be applied to the way that parties try to figure out who their leaders are going to be or how they work it out in a public setting?
Well, the conventions today are very different. They're sort of showcases for the candidates, and they're, essentially 4-day infomercials. So it's very different from back then. I mean, these were disparaged as, the smoke-filled room and a bunch of political operators, machine politicians making the decisions. And I think our modern system is probably better with the people having a say through the primary system. But on the other hand, you can't argue with what they did in 1860, choosing Lincoln. I mean, that was a pretty darn good choice for president. So I don't think we'll see a brokered convention like that again. I think the parties are too determined to control everything. But, I do think character and courage are very strong qualifications for a president. And Lincoln had that in abundance. I mean, he committed this country to a terrible war to save the idea that people can vote for president, and who they choose should be president of the whole country. You can't just split up the country when you disagree. And boy, he had courage in abundance.
It's a great reminder for us about how important that quality is. Ed, again, The Lincoln Miracle, Inside the Republican Convention That Changed History. It's a really beautiful read. And Ed, I know you're working on a project you can't tell us about, but I can't wait for that next one. So count us in for an interview when that book comes out, because this is just a little bit of the taste of your work. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions about one of the most fascinating characters in American history, which is Abraham Lincoln. But I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jenna. Keep up the good work. You're doing great work.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much.
Yep.
We'll have more links for this so you can check out the book and yourself. I started reading it and I just was suddenly transported to a different time period, and that I didn't even know. Sometimes with history books, you wonder, like, what is that going to be like? And I can't wait to continue this. So highly suggested. And Ed's work is important. So I appreciate him today. Just as we finish up here, and I believe we're going to be talking more this week. So keep your questions coming, and we'll keep this conversation happening as much as you need. There was an interesting question that came to us about the Secret Service. I know there's questions about the Secret Service and security. What's interesting, just tying this all together, is, the Secret Service came about in the 1860s around the time of the Civil War, because so much money was counterfeited that they were trying to be part of that policing of counterfeiting money. It wasn't until the 1900s and the assassination of President McKinley that the Secret Service suddenly became the security for the president. I think looking back on that would be a really interesting viewpoint for us this week. And while there's some critique of the Secret Service, we have still so much to learn. I always want to provide more answers than questions, but I think the questions now and encouraging curiosity is actually where we remain in the driver's seat to get the answers that we know that the public needs. So we have a lot more to these stories that we discussed today. I look forward to your questions. You can send voice memos to scoop@smarternews.com or hello@smarternews.com. If you're not a Scoop member, join us, become an insider, come up on the chat, and we have a nice time together before the show starts and sometimes after the show. And I really enjoy being able to interact with you in that way. And your support of Smarter News is really making a difference. So thank you for the honor and the privilege to serve you during such historic times. We'll continue to deliver quick, concise, nonpartisan information. And I look forward to your questions, thoughts, and comments. Have a great start to your week. We'll be here with more Smarter News. Bye, guys. Thank you for believing in quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News. Every time you join us or share or save our content, you help us build a solution in news, and we are so grateful. We have a few other ways you can support our mission, from joining our insider community Scoop, to shopping our gear at our Smarter Shop, to just telling a friend. The best way to do any of this is to visit smarternews.com or follow us at Smarter News on social media. Don't worry, we put all of this in the captions so it's easy for you. Plus, we added our email just in case you want to drop us a note. We always love hearing from you. Thank you for helping us deliver news smarter.